Wendy Holden, thank you for joining me all the way from Sussex, England. I'm here in Manhattan in New York City, where we are freezing. I hope it's not as bitterly cold there as it is here.
Hello, Eric. Thank you for having me. Actually, it's not so cold, but I only just got back yesterday from the Canary Islands where it was lovely and hot and balmy, and I got a nice tan. And I came back, and last night I went to bed with hat, shoes, and socks on.
It sounds
We'll see.
familiar. Yeah, we're just back from Buenos Aires and Montevideo in Uruguay, and I have to wonder why did we get on the plane to come home?
Yes, I know, I know. There we are.
Yes. So I brought you here today because remarkably, you have written a novel about one of the people we're featuring in our current Nazi era series, Fredy Hirsch. You have written a novel about Fredy Hirsch. Um, uh, and it just seems like a bizarre coincidence. Fredy Hirsch is not somebody who people generally know about. And perhaps you can tell us first who Fredy Hirsch was, and then I have a thousand questions for you.
Okay, great. Well, I always think that when things like this happen, it's called happenstance, and I think it's always a great piece of luck. And there's been lots of luck actually while I've been researching and writing Freddie's story. He was a young gay German from Aachen in Germany, the son of a master butcher and his wife. He had a fairly unremarkable assimilated childhood as a young Jewish boy in Aachen until, of course, Nazis came to power under Hitler and everything changed, hate speech and anti-Semitism and so on. And he ended up fleeing Germany to go first to Czechoslovakia, which was a liberal democracy. He hoped he would be safe enough there. Of course, sadly, he wasn't because the Germans marched in there as well. And he ended up in a ghetto in Czechoslovakia before going to Auschwitz. And in both places, he was a remarkable young man who did extraordinary things, risked his life daily to protect the thousands of children in his care.
Um, I'm going to try not to cry during this conversation. I'm so immersed in this history. We were just recording an episode today about Margot Human, who is also German, who is I think the only lesbian we have on record talking about a relationship in the camps. Um, is, she survived. Um, uh, so many people didn't, including Freddie Hirsch. How did you come to Freddie's story?
I wrote a book called 100 Miracles about a wonderful Czech musician called Zuzana Růžičková. It took me a very long time to learn to say that correctly. She was 90. She was tiny like a bird, fragile, really, but just wonderful. And she had survived three camps as a young teenage musical prodigy with her mother, lost every other member of her family, her father, her grandparents, everybody else. When war broke out, she was due to go to study in Paris. She was so talented as a pianist. And unfortunately, all of that changed because she happened to be Jewish. So everything was different, and she was in the ghetto where she met Freddie first of all, and then she went to Auschwitz where she continued to work alongside Freddie with young children. And the extraordinary thing about Susanna was that by the time war was over, this precious young teenage prodigy who was never even allowed to play sport to protect her hands, her fingers were fossilized. She lost her fingerprints through slave labor in Hamburg in between, and she had to go back to grade one piano, but she ended up becoming one of the leading Baroque musicians in the world. She switched from piano to harpsichord because she kept the music of Johann Sebastian Bach in her head. And she said as long as she had Bach in her head, there was still some beauty in the world. And after the war, she discovered that she realized, perhaps she already knew, that the piano hadn't really been invented yet. It was invented right at the end of Bach's life. So she switched to harpsichord to be true to who Johann Sebastian Bach was.
And that's how you came across Freddie Hirsch.
She was telling me very terrible things about it, what had happened to her and her family. She was obviously emotional. It was very difficult. And then her face lit up as if a light went on inside her. And she said, and then there was Freddie Hirsch. He was like a god to us. And I
Oh.
just thought, my goodness me, what's happened here? Who is this man? I need to know more about him. And that set me on the quest to find out who he was, and he was a youth leader before the war. He was a in the Jewish Scouts. He hoped to become an Olympian. He was very, very beautiful. He was a beautiful young man, an athlete, very talented athlete. Of course, he would have been denied being an Olympian because he was Jewish in the 1939 Olympics in Berlin. But he just was the most extraordinary man. He was one of those people that we need right now in the world, which is somebody who refuses to be a bystander to hate.
But you chose to do a novel and not, as a writer, which I've spent much of my life doing. I know there's certain freedom in writing fiction. Was it the wish to have that freedom to be able to enter into his mind that you chose to write a novel, or did you debate back and forth between a novel and a biography?
Yes, well, yes and no. I started it actually as a non-fiction biography because my background is that I was a journalist and a war correspondent, and my parents had both lived through the Second World War, so I have a great respect for war stories personally and professionally. But as I dug deeper and deeper, I just found that I wasn't getting enough information to really fulfill, to complete the rounded picture of him. So I'm a fellow of the Royal Historical Society in Britain, and I take it very seriously. I'm not Jewish, but when I started to write about the Holocaust, which written a few books now about it, I realized that I was sticking my head above the parapet to a certain extent, and was opening myself to Holocaust deniers. So the research had to be assiduous. It had to be absolutely thoroughly researched. It had to be fully accurate. And where I've fictionalized parts, it's each fictionalized character is based on something that somebody who was real or something that happened. I've just managed to flesh it out a little bit to be able to get inside Freddie's head, and I've written it in the first person. And the greatest accolade I could have ever received, I found that there was one left survivor of the children's block that Freddie created in Auschwitz, a lady called Dieter Kraus, who's 97. And with great trepidation, I sent her a copy of the manuscript before it was published. I had a very anxious 10 days. And when she came back, she said it was the closest possible narrative a person who did not experience those times herself could have written. This will do justice to Freddie and all those victims.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow, that's
I mean, can't get
breathtaking.
that.
No. And where did you find Dieter Kraus?
I just found her. Because I write a lot on the Holocaust, and I've got good contacts in museums and various organizations around the world. I speak a lot for the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and for and museums in Europe and Britain. And I discovered that she was alive, and I got her email address, and I wrote to her, and I had no idea she was, senile or even still able to sort of read an email. But she came straight back to me. She was extraordinary, and she was just so proud. And all of the people that I've been able to talk to, who either there are only a few left now who knew Freddie personally, or the testimonies that I've watched online, the Shoah Foundation testimonies and other testimonies, the one common denominator is this extraordinary light that goes on inside them, and they just light up with love, and I can only really describe it as joy. He gave
Mm.
he gave them heaven in Auschwitz. He gave them some of the happiest days of their lives in the most terrible of places. And maybe it was because they were in those terrible places that the contrast was so sharp, but they are really indebted to him for everything that he did.
In telling Freddie Hirsch's story, because we don't have a recording of Freddie Hirsch, we have gathered all kinds of testimony to piece together Freddie's story. We're in the process of doing that now, so I haven't heard it yet. But my producer, who's working on the episode, found the same thing in the way that people spoke about Freddie Hirsch, that he was someone so special, and as you say, the kind of person we need now. And they are out there getting their footing to speak up and resist, because the worst thing you can do in the face of bullies is to give way to them, as we've learned.
It's very difficult. I mean, I wrote my best-selling title is called Born Survivors, which tells the true story of three young mothers who hid their pregnancies from the Nazis and gave birth in the camps. And I've been all over the world to talk about that. It's been published in 25 countries. And I've been back to Austria where the women were pregnant, weighing 70 pounds, and arrived at the concentration camp. One gave birth at the gates of the camp. One had given birth on a train on the way there on a 17-day journey of hell, and one had given birth in the factory the day before the train left on a plank, literally. Two tiny 3 pound babies. And when we went back to Mauthausen, to where the camp was, where they were liberated by the Americans, I spoke to lots of people there who were the grandchildren and great grandchildren of people who'd lived in the town at the time. And the first thing I say to them is, I don't judge you. I don't judge you for not doing anything, or your parents and grandparents for not doing anything. And I don't judge you for feeling guilty now for various things. It's very interesting because a lot of the guides in the camps are actually the grandchildren of Nazis or the grandchildren of people who helped the Nazis. They feel they need to redress the balance. Because, as I know for my own purposes as a war correspondent, that we just, none of us would know what we would do. I don't know if we have time for this, but there was one amazing story of born survivors where a woman who worked in an office overlooking the railway station saw these trains pull in every single day, and these people, I mean, she almost couldn't call them human beings, disgorging from the train. She couldn't tell if they were men or women. They were shaven-headed, they were thin. They'd come from concentration camps all over Europe because it was one of the last to be liberated, and the Nazis were trying to eradicate as many as possible there. And they were marched up through the center of the town. They were denied access to food or water. They were desperate to drink from the fountain, but they weren't allowed to. And she couldn't stand it. So she was a good Austrian Catholic hausfrau. She had children, she had a husband, but she made a little hole in her pocket. And every day she went out and walked the path that they would walk. And she dropped perhaps a little piece of bread or a needle and thread or a pen and paper, something that might be useful to them or give them some sort of hope in a hopeless situation, because nobody ever came back down that hill.
Mm.
And of course, she was caught and she was arrested, and she ended up being sent to Ravensbrück, and was ironically saved because she got typhus there, and she was ironically saved by a Jewish doctor. So if you lived next to that woman, next door to that woman, and you knew what she'd done and you'd heard her story, would you risk your whole family and your children for complete strangers that the Third Reich had told you through endless propaganda were enemies of your country and enemies of you? And that's the difficulty. That's the difficulty, that none of us would know what we would do and whether how much we would be prepared to risk. But we have to risk it.
Yes, we do. I think of it also in the context of, and I'm keeping you a little longer than I said I would. I hope you don't mind.
Not at all.
Um, I think of this in the context of when people say, why didn't they leave? Um, A, people didn't know it was coming. B, I'm now 66 years old, and we're in a situation here in the United States where, as a gay Jew and having family who were killed in the Holocaust, and family who fled years before because of pogroms and came to the US, I think, what would I do? Um, and I'm old.
Yeah.
And would I pick up? And I look at my house. Would I leave my house? Would I leave my family? My parents are dead, my grandparents are dead, but I have young family. Um, and I realize it's much easier. And when I was young, I thought this, why didn't people leave? I knew all the stories. I grew up in a neighborhood of Holocaust survivors in New York City. Um, it's not so easy.
No, no, and we
Um,
can't imagine it. I mean, we have a big issue here, as I'm sure you're aware. In Britain, we have a lot of immigrants arrive by boats from, they've crossed many countries sometimes to get to us, other countries where they could have stayed. And there's a lot of criticism for that. People say, well, why did they come to Britain? Why do they keep coming all the way? The truth is, we have a fairer social service system here. We have always traditionally, as British colonialists with a terrible past, we have tried to redress that by opening our doors to people, bringing them in, not just out of altruistic reasons, but for reasons to be a workforce and so on. And of course, so the generations of families have lived here and they want to be with their families, because if you're going to up sticks, especially with a child in your arms, and leave everything and only be able to take the things that you're carrying on your back and go to a country where you don't even speak the language or know that you'll be welcome, people don't understand what a huge thing that is for people to even consider to undertake. It's got to be pretty bad where you are for
yeah.
you to want to do that. And even
Mm.
Fredy, when he left Germany, he didn't know any Czech. I mean, Czech's a very difficult language. He had no familiarity with it at all. he was leaving his father had died, his mother was at home, but she'd remarried. He was leaving his whole family that he knew, and his brother who was training to be a rabbi, and he basically left with the things on his back and risked running into the Nazis as he crossed the border, just to get away, and then had to start from scratch, and that's a huge thing.
It is. We were just in Uruguay where we're applying for permanent residency so we can come and go as we wish and have a place to go if we have to. And these thoughts cross my mind all the time. I speak a little bit of Spanish, but what would it be like? What was it like for my grandparents when they landed in the US, didn't speak a word of English? My maternal grandmother couldn't get into the US in 1922, went to Canada and crossed through the forest from Canada to the US.
Well, I should write your story.
Well, I only just learned this about my grandmother recently, and I knew my grandmother as a sort of chubby storekeeper who just adored her grandchildren. I would never have guessed that this is what she did as a young woman.
No,
Yeah.
no, it's true.
So I have a final question for you and how you metabolize this work, because it's something that I struggle with. I was in the studio today and chatting with the audio engineer who we hadn't worked with before. Turns out his grandparents were Holocaust survivors, and found myself talking with him and having a very hard time not getting teary
Yeah.
because I swim in this work now in this history. And you, non-Jew, you didn't have to do this.
No, and it's very interesting because whenever I'm in former Eastern Europe, I'm always asked the question, or the assumption is made that I'm Jewish. People say to me, "Are you Jewish?" or "You're Jewish," and I say, "No, I'm not." And they then seem quite shocked. And I've had several people ask me over the years, "Well, why are you writing about the Jews?" And I stare them very firmly in the face, and I say, "I'm writing about human beings. I'm writing about humanity. I'm writing about what could happen to you or I
Uh,
any day, in any situation, especially in the world as it is today. We are writing about man's inhumanity to man, and what I write about and what I focus on and what gets me through all of this is seeking the humanity in the inhumanity.
mm, mm.
And it's also such an enormous privilege, Eric, to be able to chronicle these stories. I finished working with Zuzana Ruzhishkova on a Friday afternoon in September 2017, and she asked me if I had everything I needed, and I said, pretty much, but I'll come back and see you in a couple of months and we'll go through everything together. And she said, do you have everything you need? And I said, I do. And I left her on the Friday and she died on the Tuesday. And her family said she stayed alive long enough, just long enough to tell you what she wanted to say. That was her final deed in life. What a privilege, what an enormous privilege to be able to do that. And because of the work I do, several of the people that I've worked with, beautiful, wonderful, life-enhancing souls, have left us very soon afterwards, quite often not ever seeing their stories published, because that wasn't the point. The point was it was bearing witness to history. It was saying this happened. And one of the last things Susanna said to me was, and this was in 2017, was that if world events were repeating themselves with, as she put it, dreadful symmetry.
She was right.
She was right.
Yeah.
And
We,
I'm glad she's here, not here now to see
yeah, yeah.
how dreadful that symmetry is becoming.
Yeah, we a number of the stories that we are sharing in our series, which come from archives, were from people who gave testimony when they were 90, or and one woman sat for 7 hours for an interview and died not long after. People were determined to tell their stories. Yeah.
They are the voices of the voiceless very often, and they speak for so many that can't anymore speak for themselves. And it's so, so important that we not only chronicle these stories, but that we promote them, that we keep talking about them, that we keep them in the public eye. I spend a great deal of time talking in schools. I talk to a lot of young people, and I remind them every single time I go that this isn't something that happened in deep dark history. Sometimes I'm accompanied by some of the Holocaust babies, that the three that I wrote about, who are all still alive and 80 in April. Amazing. We're coming to Chicago in 2 weeks to speak to a big liberation gala, because it was the Illinois Holocaust Division that liberated them. And so we're going to that, which is a marvelous thing. And we've also been invited back by the Viennese government to Mauthausen in May for the anniversary of the liberation. And they're so completely devoted to coming and doing it and telling their stories and have me be the narrator to their stories because they know more than ever now, especially as two of them still live in America, they know more than ever now how important this is.
The three children survived?
Yes, they all survived. And the crazy thing is, Eric, they were under 3 pounds. Hannah, who ended up being a biochemist testing drugs for cancer, extraordinary woman, lives in San Francisco. She was one of the first ever civilians to be treated by penicillin, which was actually at that point only available to the military. But they were so concerned that this little baby was going to die that they gave her penicillin. So that's what she did. Mark, who lives in Wisconsin and Arizona, has been an emergency doctor his whole life. He does pro bono work, just amazing. And Eva, who lives in England, not far from where I live in East Anglia, she's been educational her life and she's devoted the last probably 20 years of her life to speaking in Holocaust educational institutions and to schools, very often with me. I mean, life enhancing, life giving, extraordinary people who've gone on to have children and grandchildren and they're just wonderful, upbeat, positive people. They and no physical side effects at all that I can figure out. And Mark's a doctor, so he would know. The only thing they have in common, rather bizarrely, is that they are all highly allergic to insect bites. And of course, when the mothers were pregnant, they were crawling with lice and fleas.
Oh my goodness.
Who knew? I mean, it's extraordinary.
Well,
Extraordinary.
and what an extraordinary life you have doing what you do. Um,
Such an honor.
yeah, I hear you. I understand. I carry through this current work and then through my LGBTQ history work, I carry so many voices in my head, people I knew who have since died, and I feel enormous responsibility
Yes.
to share their stories. So
I get so much from it too, and I'm sure you do too. And what better thing to wake up every morning and spend your life in the company, either physically or virtually, with people who are the epitome of selflessness, who are moral compasses, spiritual guides almost
yeah,
to other people, and who are still waving a flag even though they may longer never be with us. And
yeah,
that's what an extraordinary job to be able to do that and be in their
yeah.
company every day. I'm so happy to be in the company of all of them. And each time I finish a book, and when I finished Fredy, I felt quite bereft because I feel so close to him.
Well, I so look forward to reading your book when it makes its way to the US. And it's such a joy speaking with you. And thank you for your work. It's
Thank
essential
you.
and life-giving work.
Well, I'm absolutely a devoted listener to yours now, so we shall maybe talk about the next one I do whenever I get round to doing that one.
I look forward to it. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Eric.
Bye-bye.